Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mohamed Malas. I'm here at Environmental Defense Canada's offices, and I am joined by Idria Vazel, who is...
You pronounced it right.
Oh, I got it. Thank you. Who is an environmental journalist and the author of the best-selling Ecoholic book series. And we're here to talk about Environmental Defense Canada's recent testing of food products and the findings related to glyphosate contamination in the food products that we tested. So we'll get to that discussion in a second, but just wanted to remind everyone that if you have any questions throughout the conversation, feel free to post them in the comment box or section of the video on Facebook, and we'll try to address them throughout the discussion. But if we don't get to your questions, we'll make sure to answer them on Facebook later on. So thank you again for joining us, and I will hand it off to Idria.
Thanks so much, Mohamed, and hi, everybody. Mohamed, to get us started, can you tell us about the chemical at the heart of your latest report, glyphosate? What is it? What's so wrong with it?
So glyphosate is a pesticide or an herbicide, so it's a weed killer. It's the world's most widely used weed killer. And glyphosate, many people would know it as Roundup because in the 1970s, Monsanto introduced glyphosate for the first time into Roundup as a product. So glyphosate is, because of its ubiquity and extensive use in agriculture, glyphosate is known to contaminate food, but it's also in our air, in our soil, in our water. And there's a lot of evidence that glyphosate is a harmful chemical due to its links to cancer, but also links to other health problems.
Didn't Monsanto just get sued for that cancer connection?
Yeah, so a court case in the US last month concluded that glyphosate has contributed to an American citizen's cancer. There was a lot of controversy before the court case, and that controversy continues when it comes to glyphosate's link to cancer. But what we know in terms of the evidence that it's linked to cancer is through the World Health Organization's findings in 2015 that it is a probable carcinogenic, which means that it's likely to cause cancer. And after that, there were many other scientific studies that came out to support that conclusion, but also other studies that came out to conclude that it is not carcinogenic. So what the significance of this court case is that the court case ruled that there's enough evidence that it contributed to this American citizen's cancer, and that the company, Monsanto, has for many years downplayed the risk of this pesticide and the products that they used. And because of that, it raised, we now have a lot of questions that are raised about the credibility of the science that some regulators around the world, including Health Canada, used to determine the safety of this pesticide.
So let's get back to a bit more to regulation, how it's regulated in Canada in a minute. But first, I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are asking themselves, well, the man at the heart of this particular lawsuit was a groundskeeper. He was exposed to Roundup very regularly. But if you're not a groundskeeper, if you're not a farmer, and you're not actually spraying Roundup in your everyday work life, how much of a risk is this?
That's a great question, and I think that's the question that we're seeing a lot of people, asking after we released the study. And so the reason why we wanted to do this study is because we wanted to tell people that, glyphosate, which is, a chemical or a pesticide that is linked to cancer and has been linked to other health conditions, is found in our food, not just, in grains, but also in processed foods. So, if you want to think about the products that we tested, like hummus and cereals and oats.
Okay, wait. I eat a lot of hummus. This is a problem. Can you tell us a little bit more about the products that you did test and what you found?
Yeah, sure. So in the case of hummus, we tested 2 hummus products, and we found that both of them contained glyphosate. And we also tested a kind of chickpeas, and we also found that chickpeas contained glyphosate. We also tested many breakfast foods. So we tested cereals, 2 brands of favorite brands of cereals that many children eat, and also oats. And we also tested crackers, bagels, donuts. So a whole diverse set of foods that many people may have thought did not contain glyphosate, and most of them came back with the result that they did contain glyphosate.
They did contain. glyphosate. Now, of course, industry will say, and also the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has said that while these levels are trace levels, and they're at such low levels at parts per billion that you don't really have to worry about them. What would you say to that?
Mm-hmm. So we did find that the results came back that they were trace levels. What trace levels mean is that they were low levels, but that doesn't mean that those levels aren't a concern. So yes, the levels that we found were in parts per billion. Health Canada's safe limits are set at parts per million, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned, because the main question that we're raising here is whether Health Canada's safe limits were actually made based on sound science. And if we also want to look at some other chemicals that we know about, so I'll use an example of BPA. BPA and glyphosate are completely two different chemicals, so I'll acknowledge that. But over time, we discovered that BPA, the safe levels of BPA exposure, continued to drop. So scientists kept saying that, oh, we thought the safe level is this, but it's actually much lower. And now we're getting to a point where scientists are questioning whether there is a safe level. But also lead is another example where the exposure even to very, very low levels, so trace levels in parts per billion, can lead to big impacts to our health. So looking at those examples, I think it's not really surprising or unreasonable to say that there is a risk or there is concern with exposure to parts per billion.
So, I'm sorry, I've knocked off my microphone. Excuse me, everybody.
And I guess just wanted to make sure that for people who have just joined us, we're here to talk about the latest study that Environmental Defence Canada published, highlighting the results that glyphosate was found in many food products that we tested. And I'm here joined by Adria Vazel, who is an environmental journalist, and we're talking about our findings and also answering any questions that you may have about the findings.
So Mohammed, if the World Health Organization said that this is what kind of carcinogen? A likely probable carcinogen.
Probable carcinogenic, yeah.
How has Health Canada responded? Did they then step in and start restricting its use? What's happening on the ground there?
So Health Canada very recently, so last year, concluded its review or reevaluation, to use technical terms here, of glyphosate and its safety and its use. And what I find very alarming is that Health Canada has decided to continue allowing its use for another 15 years without any checks. So they're not really restricting the use of glyphosate. And when we look at the international community and what other countries are doing,
right.
In Europe there was a huge political debate about whether to continue to allow glyphosate. And recently the European Union decided to allow it for 5 more years, just until they figure out what to do next. But other countries in Europe, or specific countries in Europe like France, Austria, Germany, have all committed to banning glyphosate within 3 to 5 years.
Oh, really?
So looking at that context, yeah, and then comparing it to what Health Canada is saying, it sort of raises questions about whether Health Canada is doing the right thing in terms of keeping this pesticide on the market for as long, for 15 more years, but also making such confident conclusions about its safety.
Do you think that Health Canada is being too soft on industry?
So I want to go back to that point that we raised about the significance of the court cases in the U.S., or specifically that one court case. So that one court case that was where there was a ruling last month about glyphosate's contribution to an American citizen's cancer. Throughout the proceedings of the court case, there were many documents that were disclosed that were secret documents, and also communication documents between pesticide companies and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And what we found is that for many years, the industry downplayed the risk of glyphosate, but also made up fake results about the safety of glyphosate. And those conclusions that were provided by the industry to the Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S. ended up influencing the conclusions of the EPA. Now, where our concern as Canadians come in is that Health Canada works very closely with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on reevaluations of pesticide, including glyphosate. So we really are raising questions here about the credibility of Health Canada's scientific assessment.
That brings up a lot for all of us to think about. And I'm sure people in the audience are asking, okay, so if I am concerned, if I do want to take precautions, regardless of what Health Canada is saying about safety of the ingredient and the levels that it's at, what precautions can the average person take to minimize their exposure?
So I think, unfortunately, what our findings, the findings of our study show is that glyphosate is consistently showing up in our foods. And that's a problem because it makes it harder to avoid exposure to glyphosate.
Right.
But it's not impossible to reduce our exposure to glyphosate, which I think is the key message here. Is that we need to, as consumers, as families, and parents, to try to reduce our exposure as much as possible by choosing and selecting foods that we know are likely to contain no glyphosate or to contain, very low levels of glyphosate. So, as an example, certified organic foods are likely to contain no or little glyphosate
and by little, that would be because you can't really, even with certified organic food, completely protect the crop from all exposure to environmental contaminants and possible pesticides in the air. Is that?
That is right. So even with organic farming, there's a risk of contamination of the organic crops because of exposure through nearby fields or through other environmental ways of exposure.
Yeah. But there would be no direct application of glyphosate,
exactly.
Obviously. Yeah. Okay.
But at the end of the day, and ultimately, what we're, the message that we're trying to promote here is that this issue is so systemic, and it shouldn't be up to consumers to try to find or navigate their way about exposure, and that what we want to see is Health Canada and the Government of Canada taking action to strengthen the laws that we have that regulate how pesticides and toxic chemicals are allowed in products, allowed in food, and also to take action on those chemicals of concern, including glyphosate. So that's the ultimate message, and that's what we're hoping that Canadians and the public will do, is to talk to their members of parliament, to talk to ministers who are responsible about these decisions, and also to talk to companies and encourage companies to look for options that may have lower or no contamination of glyphosate.
Well, thank you for that. We are going to go to Facebook to take some questions.
Sounds good. And just before we take the first question, I just wanted to remind everyone, especially those who have just joined us, that we're here to chat about the findings of Environmental Defence Canada's recent testing of food products, which showed that glyphosate is consistently showing up in food products that people eat on a daily basis. I'm Mohamed Malas with Environmental Defence Canada, and I'm joined by Adria Vazel, who is an environmental journalist, and she's here with me to talk about the findings.
Thanks, Mohamed. Now we are going to take a question from Farah, who asks, is it true that Italy imports less wheat from Canada now because our glyphosate levels are too high?
That's a great question. Yes, it is true. So the exports of durum wheat, which is the main type of wheat that is used in pasta, to Italy have really been impacted because some testing showed that the levels of contamination in our wheat is significantly higher than the level of contamination in Italian wheat.
Interesting.
So because of that, and I think what's specifically concerning here from an economic perspective is that I believe about 20% of our exports of durum wheat go to Italy. So that's a huge proportion, and that has implications economically on the agriculture sector in Canada.
Do you think this is because the levels of glyphosate are lower because they actually don't allow genetically modified crops, which tend to use more glyphosate?
I think they have different limits,
Right.
set by regulators on how much glyphosate is allowed, but also there's a more, I guess, there's public awareness in Italy about this issue, and pasta is one of the favorite dishes in Italy, so obviously people will be paying attention to what's in their pasta, especially when it's imported.
Sacrilege, yeah. Don't mess with the pasta. Now we have a question from Tessa. Shouldn't the companies making these products be disciplined? Well, what do you think?
Another great question. So just to go back to the findings of our study, so we found that the food products that we tested that contained glyphosate contained levels of glyphosate below what Health Canada considers a problem. So companies are following the rules, but what we're trying to convey here as a message is that our rules are broken and they need to be fixed. So companies can take action and take steps to reduce contamination of glyphosate, and that's definitely a welcome effort if any company decides to or commits to taking action. So as an example, in the US, Ben & Jerry's, which is a popular ice cream brand, has committed to taking some steps to reducing glyphosate contamination in their ice creams. So that's something that we encourage and urge companies to look at. But ultimately, what we want to see here is a reform of the way that we regulate and allow these harmful pesticides to be in our food and to be used in agriculture to begin with.
After the American lawsuit, do you think there's any potential for lawsuits against actual brands that contain this ingredient, particularly in states like California, where there seems to be a bit more kind of legal room for this kind of lawsuit?
So we are seeing that the number of lawsuits that are being filed in the U.S. is increasing. So we have, I think, thousands of lawsuits that are, against the pesticide manufacturer and also against some companies. But in terms of in Canada, again, I guess what I wanted to emphasize is that consumers need to, think about why this pesticide is being found in our food, and that's because we have regulations that allow it, right? So ultimately, we need to fix those regulations as opposed to, think about, taking legal action on companies that are following the rules. Right. But it is important also to urge companies to take steps to reduce the contamination. So I think there's a dual responsibility both on industry and also on companies to do their due diligence and to ensure that we're protected.
Okay, thanks. And we have a question from Barbara. What is Environmental Defence doing about Health Canada's decision to extend the registration of this pesticide?
So Environmental Defence Canada is obviously very concerned about this decision that Health Canada has proposed to renew the authorization or use of glyphosate for 15 more years. Right. So what we have done is we've partnered with other NGOs or non-government organizations that are concerned about environmental and health impacts, and we submitted a notice of objection about the reevaluation and the conclusion that Health Canada put forward last year. And in that notice of objection, we pointed many areas in the reevaluation where we thought there were gaps in the science that was assessed, there were gaps in the risks that were looked at, and we're hoping to hear back from Health Canada at some point. It's been over a year since we submitted that objection.
Okay.
And hopefully we'll hear back in the next couple of months. And in the meantime, we wanted to make sure that the public is aware about these issues. So one of the reasons, or one of the key reasons why we did this study is to ensure that people are aware that glyphosate is a potential problem that we have to address immediately because of its health risks and also environmental risks.
Thank you. And unless we have any more Facebook questions, that might be it for today. Thank you so much for taking the time
and
to
just
answer
as a reminder, if you have more questions that may come up later, please feel free to post them on our Facebook page or also email us, and we'll be happy to answer them. And again, thank you for joining us and making the time to be a part of this discussion, and thank you to Andrea for being here. Really appreciate it. And it's always nice to talk to you about these, important issues.
Yeah, we agree. We definitely agree on these important issues.
And stay tuned on more in terms of our work on glyphosate and other chemicals of concern. We have a website that we encourage you to visit, so what'sinyourlunch.ca, and that website will provide information about the findings of our study, but also you can take action there by signing our petition, which will go straight to the Ministers of Health and the Environment in Canada, calling on those ministers to reform our laws and take action on glyphosate and other chemicals of concern. And once again, thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.